The moment we lose our innocence isn't when we first encounter death or witness cruelty, or even when we commit our first deliberate act of harm. According to Arthur Schopenhauer, it's when we first recognize the insatiable nature of our own will, that relentless force driving us forward through an endless cycle of desire and disappointment. This revelation doesn't arrive in a single transformative instant, but creeps into our awareness slowly, like a shadow lengthening across the floor of consciousness. And once we see it, we can never return to the blessed ignorance of childhood. Today, I'll guide you through Schopenhauer's profound insight into this transition from innocence to the burden of consciousness, a journey that explains why so many of us feel a nameless longing for something we can't define, and why understanding this truth might be your first step toward either profound liberation or devastating despair. We all remember moments from childhood when happiness seemed so simple: a perfect summer day, a beloved toy, the comfort of a parent's embrace. What made those moments so pure was not their content, but our relationship to our own experience. Children live primarily in the immediate present, their desires simple and direct. But as consciousness develops, so does our unique human burden, the ability to reflect on our own existence, to anticipate future desires, and to carry the weight of past disappointments. Schopenhauer recognized that this transition marks the true end of childhood and the beginning of our lifelong struggle with what he called the will, the blind, insatiable force that drives all living things. Schopenhauer himself experienced this transition early and dramatically. Born to wealthy parents in Danzig in 1788, his early life was marked by privilege and intellectual freedom. But when his father died, likely by suicide, when Arthur was just 17, the young philosopher-to-be was thrust into a profound confrontation with the nature of human suffering. This personal tragedy coincided with his intellectual discovery of Kant and Eastern philosophy, particularly Buddhism and Hinduism, creating the perfect conditions for his unique philosophical vision to develop. While his contemporaries celebrated reason and progress, Schopenhauer looked deeper and saw something disturbing at the core of human experience, an endless cycle of desire and disappointment that no amount of rational thinking could resolve. What Schopenhauer discovered was something so fundamental, yet so rarely articulated, that it remains revolutionary even today. He identified that beneath our conscious thoughts, beneath our cherished beliefs about who we are and what we want, lies something more primitive and powerful: the will to live. This force operates through us, but is not truly ours. It is impersonal, relentless, and ultimately indifferent to our happiness. The will manifests as desire in all its forms: hunger, thirst, sexual longing, ambition, curiosity, creating a perpetual state of wanting that can never be permanently satisfied. The central problem Schopenhauer identified is not that we experience desires. This is simply part of being alive, but that we fundamentally misunderstand their nature. We believe that satisfying a particular desire will bring lasting happiness, that achieving a specific goal will finally allow us to rest content. But this is the great illusion. In reality, the fulfillment of any desire brings only momentary relief before the will asserts itself again in a new form. Consider how many times you've thought, if I just get this promotion, or if I could just find the right partner, or if I could just afford that house, only to find that achieving these goals brought a satisfaction so fleeting it hardly seemed real before new desires emerged. The moment of revelation in Schopenhauer's philosophy comes when we truly understand that this pattern is not a defect in our individual psychology, but the very structure of conscious existence. The child who believes the new toy will bring lasting happiness grows into the adult who believes the same about career achievements, relationships, or material possessions, just with more sophisticated justifications. The end of childhood, philosophically speaking, is the recognition that this pattern will continue indefinitely, that there is no final satisfaction waiting for us if we just make the right choices or accumulate the right experiences. Looking at human behavior empirically, the evidence for Schopenhauer's insight is overwhelming. Consider how quickly we adapt to both positive and negative changes in our circumstances. The new car that thrilled us loses its luster within weeks. The promotion that consumed our ambition for years becomes the new normal almost immediately after we achieve it. Even profound life events like marriage or the birth of a child, while deeply meaningful, don't produce the permanent state of fulfillment we might have imagined. Psychologists now call this hedonic adaptation, but Schopenhauer recognized it centuries ago as evidence of the will's insatiable nature. The truly disturbing aspect of Schopenhauer's philosophy is not the recognition of this cycle, but the realization that it operates largely beyond our conscious control. We don't choose our deepest desires. They emerge from biological imperatives and unconscious drives that evolved long before human consciousness. Even as we intellectually recognize the futility of seeking permanent satisfaction through the fulfillment of desires, we find ourselves compelled to continue the pursuit. This creates a uniquely human form of suffering. We are conscious enough to see the pattern, but rarely free enough to break it. Historically, various philosophical and spiritual traditions have recognized aspects of this condition. Buddhism identifies attachment and craving as the root causes of suffering. Stoicism emphasizes the importance of desiring only what is within our control. Christianity speaks of the futility of worldly pursuits, but Schopenhauer's innovation was to ground this insight in a comprehensive philosophical framework that connected it to both scientific understanding and everyday experience. He didn't merely observe the pattern, he explained its metaphysical foundations and psychological mechanisms. At the core of Schopenhauer's explanation is his distinction between the world as will and the world as representation. Everything we experience, the entire phenomenal world, is a representation constructed by our minds based on sensory input. But behind this representation lies the thing in itself, which Schopenhauer identifies as will. The will is not merely human volition, but the fundamental reality underlying all existence, an impersonal, unconscious force that manifests differently at different levels of complexity, but remains essentially the same, from the gravitational pull between objects to the complex desires of human consciousness. The primary danger in Schopenhauer's philosophy lies in its potential to lead to nihilism. If all striving is ultimately futile, if satisfaction is always temporary, if suffering is inherent to existence, what meaning can life possibly have? Many readers of Schopenhauer stop here, seeing only the bleak landscape of his pessimism, but this is a superficial reading that misses the profound possibilities his philosophy opens for those willing to follow it to its conclusion. A secondary problem emerges when we consider how deeply our social structures and cultural narratives are built around the promise that fulfilling certain desires will bring lasting happiness. From advertising to education to politics, we are continuously sold variations on this fundamental lie. Recognizing its falsity can create a sense of alienation from society and its values. The person who sees through the illusion that Schopenhauer identified often finds themselves at odds with a world that remains committed to the pursuit of illusory satisfaction. The psychological impact of truly internalizing Schopenhauer's insight varies dramatically between individuals. For some, it creates a crushing despair as the futility of their pursuits becomes apparent. For others, it brings a profound liberation. The recognition that they've been playing a game they can never win allows them to stop playing entirely. Some find themselves oscillating between these states, intellectually convinced of the truth of Schopenhauer's analysis, but emotionally unable to fully accept its implications. This pattern repeats across cultures and historical periods. We see it in the midlife crises that strike successful individuals who achieve everything they thought they wanted, only to find themselves still unsatisfied. We see it in the widespread disillusionment that often follows periods of material prosperity. We see it in the persistent unhappiness of wealthy societies despite their unprecedented abundance. The end of childhood, the loss of the belief that satisfaction lies just beyond the horizon, can happen to entire civilizations as well as individuals. Why do we resist this insight so powerfully? Schopenhauer suggests it's because the will to live operates through us, using the intellect as its servant rather than its master. The will has no interest in our happiness, only in our continued striving, which serves its purposes. Accepting the truth about the nature of desire and satisfaction would potentially undermine our motivation to pursue the will's aims. So we develop elaborate psychological defenses against this recognition. We convince ourselves that our disappointment with past achievements was merely because we chose the wrong objects of desire, not because desire itself is inherently unsatisfiable. This resistance isn't merely individual, but collective. Our entire social and economic system depends on the continued pursuit of satisfaction through consumption and achievement. Advertising, entertainment, and even education constantly reinforce the message that happiness awaits us if we just make the right purchases, pursue the right experiences, or develop the right skills. Those who see through this illusion often find themselves not just psychologically, but socially isolated, unable to fully participate in a collective delusion they no longer share. When we examine human behavior systematically, certain patterns emerge that support Schopenhauer's analysis. First, we consistently overestimate the duration and intensity of satisfaction we'll derive from achieving our goals, a phenomenon psychologists now call impact bias. Second, we engage in hedonic treadmill behavior, quickly adapting to new circumstances and returning to baseline levels of satisfaction regardless of external changes. Third, we demonstrate focusing illusion, overestimating the importance of singular factors in determining our overall happiness. These patterns, documented by contemporary psychological research, provide empirical support for Schopenhauer's philosophical insights. Schopenhauer categorized different human responses to the recognition of the will's nature. Some people, upon glimpsing this truth, immediately recoil and double down on pursuit of desire, desperately trying to prove the insight wrong through increasingly frantic activity. Others sink into despair or cynicism, seeing no point in any pursuit once its ultimate futility is recognized. A smaller group attempts to temporarily silence the will through aesthetic contemplation, finding moments of respite in art, music, or nature. And the rarest individuals move toward what Schopenhauer called denial of the will to live, not through suicide, which he considered an affirmation rather than a denial of the will, but through a profound detachment from desire itself. The first type, those who redouble their commitment to pursuing satisfaction through fulfillment of desire, are what we might call the willfully unconscious. They may have momentarily glimpsed the truth about the nature of desire and satisfaction, but they quickly suppress this knowledge and return to their pursuits with renewed vigor. These individuals often achieve great worldly success precisely because they remain fully in service to the will, unhindered by philosophical doubts about its ultimate purpose or value. But their success comes at the cost of authentic self-knowledge, and they frequently experience profound crisis when circumstances eventually force them to confront what they've been avoiding. The second type, those who fall into despair or cynicism, represent what happens when the intellect grasps the truth about the will, but lacks the strength to move beyond this initial recognition. These individuals see clearly the futility of desire, but cannot envision any alternative mode of existence. Their despair is not a failure of understanding, but a failure of imagination or spiritual resources. They know what is false, but cannot glimpse what might be true beyond the illusion. This position, while intellectually honest, leaves them stranded in a psychological wasteland, unable to find meaning or purpose once the conventional sources have been revealed as inadequate. The third type, those who seek refuge in aesthetic contemplation, have discovered what Schopenhauer considered one of the few genuine sources of respite from the tyranny of the will. In the experience of great art, particularly music, the individual temporarily steps outside the endless cycle of desire and satisfaction, becoming a pure, will-less subject of knowledge. This aesthetic state doesn't eliminate the will, but suspends its operation, allowing for moments of genuine peace. However, these moments remain temporary, and the individual must eventually return to the ordinary world of striving and disappointment. The fourth and rarest type are those who achieve what Schopenhauer calls denial of the will to live, a state similar to what Eastern traditions describe as enlightenment or liberation. This is not a rejection of life itself, but of the blind striving that normally characterizes it. Through profound recognition of the unity of all being and the illusion of individuality, these individuals transcend the ordinary operation of the will. Their compassion emerges not from rules or principles, but from direct perception of the unity underlying apparent separation. They continue to live, but are no longer driven by the same forces that govern most human lives. The integration process between recognizing the nature of the will and finding a sustainable response involves several stages. Initially, there's often shock and resistance, as the implications of Schopenhauer's insight begin to penetrate our defenses. This may be followed by a period of despair or nihilism, as conventional sources of meaning lose their power. Gradually, if the process continues healthily, the individual begins to discover new sources of value that don't depend on the fulfillment of desire, primarily compassion for others and aesthetic appreciation. The final stage involves a transformation of consciousness itself, where the individual no longer identifies exclusively with their individual will, but recognizes it as part of a larger whole. This process carries significant dangers. The transition from childhood's naive optimism to philosophical awareness of the will's nature creates a vulnerable period where nihilism and despair are real risks. Without adequate philosophical resources or supportive community, individuals may become stuck in destructive patterns of thought or behavior. Suicide becomes a particular risk for those who see the truth about the will's endless striving, but cannot envision any alternative. Schopenhauer himself, despite his pessimistic reputation, strongly condemned suicide as a misguided attempt to escape the will that actually affirms it in its most extreme form. Negative examples of this process abound. Consider the midlife crisis that strikes successful professionals who achieve everything they thought would bring happiness, only to find themselves still unfulfilled. Without a philosophical framework for understanding this experience, they often attempt to resolve it through superficial changes, new relationships, possessions, or careers that merely restart the cycle rather than transcending it. Or consider the phenomenon of affluenza in wealthy societies, where material abundance creates not satisfaction, but new forms of spiritual poverty and psychological distress. Positive examples can be found in the lives of artists, philosophers, and spiritual practitioners who move through disillusionment to discover deeper sources of meaning. Tolstoy's spiritual crisis and subsequent transformation, documented in A Confession, follows the pattern Schopenhauer described. Similarly, many Buddhist practitioners report that the recognition of desire's unsatisfiable nature, while initially disturbing, eventually leads to profound peace, as they learn to relate to desire differently rather than continuing to serve its demands. Even Schopenhauer himself, despite his reputation for personal irascibility, found genuine joy in philosophical contemplation, music, and literature. The personal transformation. Schopenhauer's philosophy begins with intellectual recognition, but must eventually penetrate deeper levels of being. Understanding the cycle of desire and disappointment intellectually is only the first step. The challenge is to embody this understanding in one's actual relationship to experience. This involves developing the capacity to observe desires arising without automatically identifying with them or feeling compelled to pursue their satisfaction. It requires cultivating what contemporary mindfulness traditions call non-attachment, not indifference to life, but a different way of relating to its contents. The stages of this transformation parallel the journey from childhood to mature consciousness, but recapitulate it at a higher level. Just as the child must eventually recognize the limitations of immediate gratification, the philosophically awakened adult must recognize the limitations of all desire-based pursuits. Just as childhood innocence gives way to adolescent questioning, philosophical awakening initially creates confusion and resistance before potentially leading to a more integrated understanding. And just as healthy development requires both losing illusions and discovering new sources of meaning, philosophical development requires both seeing through the mirage of desire-based happiness and discovering alternative sources of value. Several warnings and traps appear along this path. The first is premature exposure to these ideas before one has developed the psychological resources to handle them constructively. Schopenhauer's philosophy can be devastating to those who glimpse its truth, but lack the framework to move beyond initial despair. Another trap is intellectual understanding, without emotional integration, knowing the truth about desire intellectually while remaining emotionally enslaved to its patterns. Perhaps most dangerously, some individuals use philosophical pessimism as justification for withdrawal from life's responsibilities or for treating others with contempt rather than the compassion Schopenhauer saw as the natural consequence of recognizing the unity of all being. Maintenance of the insights gained through engaging with Schopenhauer's philosophy requires ongoing practice rather than one-time revelation. The pull of habitual patterns of desire and striving remains powerful even after their nature is recognized. This is why Schopenhauer emphasized the importance of art, particularly music, as a regular source of temporary liberation from the will's demands. Similarly, he valued philosophical contemplation not as abstract theorizing, but as a living practice that must be regularly renewed. And he recognized the ethical dimension of this maintenance. Compassionate action toward others reinforces our recognition of the illusory nature of separate selfhood. Higher integration of Schopenhauer's insights involves moving beyond even the duality of will and representation to what he sometimes hinted at, but never fully articulated, a state of consciousness that transcends both suffering and the individual perspective entirely. Here his philosophy approaches mystical traditions that speak of unity with the absolute or dissolution of the separate self. While Schopenhauer remained skeptical about the possibility of describing this state in conceptual terms, he acknowledged it as the logical endpoint of the path his philosophy began. Let's pause for a moment. As we talk about how Schopenhauer uncovered this transition from childhood's innocence to the burden of consciousness, I want to ask you something personal. Have you ever experienced that moment when something you desperately wanted finally became yours, only to find the joy fading almost immediately, leaving you already looking toward the next desire? That crushing realization that even the achievements or possessions you were certain would bring lasting happiness turned out to be just another temporary fix? I know it's difficult to acknowledge because we're taught that we should be grateful, that we should be satisfied with what we've accomplished. But if you dare, leave me a comment saying, "I recognize the weight of consciousness when dumb," and complete it with your experience. Your honesty might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to feel less alone in their struggle. Sometimes naming our condition is the first step toward transforming it, and Schopenhauer gives us the language to do exactly that. Let's continue now with how we might move beyond this recognition towards something more sustainable. In reflecting on Schopenhauer's philosophy, we find a thinker who fully confronted the darkest aspects of human existence without flinching. He saw clearly the machinery of desire and disappointment that operates through all of us, and he recognized the particular burden that consciousness places on human beings. We alone can see the wheel we're trapped on, but Schopenhauer's ultimate contribution wasn't this diagnosis, but the possibility of transcendence he identified. Through compassion, aesthetic experience, and philosophical understanding, he suggested we might not escape the wheel entirely, but could at least momentarily step outside its rotation. The death of childhood, the recognition that no achievement, possession, or relationship will bring permanent satisfaction, is a necessary disillusionment, but it need not lead to despair. Rather, it can open us to more authentic ways of being that don't depend on the fulfillment of desire for their value. Schopenhauer himself found genuine joy in music, literature, and philosophical contemplation, precisely because these experiences temporarily liberated him from the tyranny of the will. And his ethics of compassion, based not on abstract principles, but on direct recognition of the suffering we share with all beings, offers a way of living meaningfully, even in the absence of permanent happiness. Perhaps the most profound insight in Schopenhauer's philosophy is that consciousness, while initially appearing as a burden that separates us from childhood's innocent immersion in experience, contains within itself the seeds of its own transcendence. The same reflective capacity that allows us to recognize the futility of desire-based pursuits also allows us to step outside their grip, at least momentarily. The same ability to recognize suffering in ourselves helps us recognize it in others and respond with compassion rather than competition. The weight of consciousness is real, but it need not crush us. It can instead become the foundation for a more authentic way of being in the world. If you've recognized yourself in Schopenhauer's insights, if you felt that transition from childhood's innocent desires to the burden of conscious awareness, you're not alone on this path. This channel is a sanctuary for those seeking to understand the deepest truths of human existence, not to wallow in pessimism, but to find authentic freedom beyond the illusions that keep us trapped. I invite you to subscribe, not as another number, but as part of a community of seekers who dare to look beneath the surface of conventional wisdom. Every week, we explore philosophical insights like these and how to apply them to find peace amid life's inevitable challenges. Share in the comments which aspect of Schopenhauer's understanding of consciousness resonates most strongly with your experience. I read each reflection and respond personally. And if you know someone struggling with the weight of unfulfilled expectations or the sense that life should somehow be more than it is, share this video with them. Sometimes the understanding we need most comes through those who recognize our condition. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll explore how Schopenhauer believed art creates spaces of freedom in a world dominated by the will. Until then, remember, seeing clearly, however painful initially, is the necessary first step toward living authentically.